We'll discuss Saul's new Frege puzzle. Okay, so the general upshot or lesson or consequence of this puzzle is as follows. So Saul presents a number of cases where simple sentences, so sentences not containing verbs like believes, where these simple sentences seem to shift in truth value and not just cognitive value when co-referring names are replaced. So again, in the original Frege puzzles, in these simple sentences, the sentences didn't change truth value, but they changed cognitive value. But when we have had non-simple sentences where we're talking about someone's belief, say, um, the sentences did change truth value. Now, Saul's puzzle is that she has found cases in which sentences which differ only with regard to co-referring names, these simple sentences seem to actually shift in truth value. So she has a number of examples in the paper, and if you've chosen this as an essay topic, it's worth looking at all of those kind of examples potentially. But in this lecture, let me just give you two of the main examples that she gives. Okay, so the first example. So I want you to imagine for this contrast that in the relevant context that these sentences are being uttered, we're on the street corner in New York or wherever Superman lives, and a man wearing a suit and tie goes into a phone booth, and this man comes out in Superman's superhero costume. Okay, so in this case, for A, it's totally true to say the following. Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Superman came out. Okay, so again, 4A seems totally true as a thing to say. But now Saul remarks that 4B seems false. Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Clark Kent came out. Now notice that this sentence doesn't involve any fancy words like believes, okay? And the only difference between 4A and 4B is these co-referring names, Superman and Clark Kent, okay? Because Superman is Clark Kent. But it seems that in this case, saying that Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Superman came out is true, whereas saying that Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Clark Kent came out is false. Okay, so here we have these simple sentences where we have just replaced co-referring names and we get actually a change in truth value. Okay, it seems again that 4A is true and 4B is false. Here's another example. So we're just assuming that superheroes are obviously more appealing romantically than ordinary people, okay, which seems like a reasonable assumption. So for 5A, the following sentence, 5A, seems true. Superman was more successful with women than Clark Kent. Okay, so this seems like something that could be said truly. Okay, but it doesn't seem true to say the following. Superman was more successful with women than Superman. That just seems like an odd thing to say. And it seems like it's false, because how could one person, Superman, be more successful with women than himself? So 5B seems false, but 5A seems true. Here, and again, 5A is that we say that Superman was more successful with women than Clark Kent. Okay, so here again we have another example where we have a simple sentence, and between these two simple sentences, the only difference are co-referring proper names, but yet we have a difference in truth value, and not just a difference in cognitive value as Frege's original puzzles were. So I think that these contrasts here that Saul has given between in 4 and 5 that I've given here, I think these are very puzzling and strange sentences to think about. Okay, so I think this puzzle is very interesting and also difficult. Okay, because it really does seem like the truth value of a sentence only depends on the reference of its parts, and especially that is the case when you have simple sentences like this. Okay, so because it just seems very intuitive that the truth value of these sentences should just be based on the reference of their parts, it's very difficult to see how that can be consistent with the difference in truth value in 4a and b, or between 5a and 5b. Okay, so these are just very difficult challenges, and it's really difficult to think of what is actually happening in these cases. Okay, so that's kind of why I've assigned this as a potential essay topic, just to try to think about what is the right thing to say about these kind of contrasts, because they're very interesting and difficult, and they're kind of different than any of the things that we've looked at so far in this class in discussions of Frege's puzzle. Okay, so in the remainder of this video, let me go over some of the possible ways of trying to explain what's happening here. So there's a couple different ways that Saul mentions for accounting for these differences, and she also criticizes them. Okay, so in the remainder of this video, let me discuss some of the possible ways of trying to deal with what's happening here in these very strange contrasts. Okay. So the first suggested solution is to claim that actually these names, Superman and Clark Kent, these names and names in general do not refer to individuals, okay? But rather, names refer to temporal phases of individuals, so parts of an individual's life, okay? So what this proposal is claiming is that actually these names, Superman and Clark Kent, are not co-referring. On this proposal, actually, the name Superman refers to the parts of this person's life when he's wearing a costume, and the name Clark Kent refers to the parts of his life when he is a normal person wearing a suit and tie. It makes simple sense of how it is that these two sentences can differ in truth value. For if the name Superman refers to the parts of this guy's life where he's wearing a costume, and the name Clark Kent refers to the parts of this guy's life when he's wearing normal clothes, it makes sense of how when, in a case where he goes in and changes from normal clothes to the costume, it's true that Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Superman came out. But it's not true that Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Clark Kent came out, because he came out in a different outfit and as a part of this different temporal stage. And this can similarly make sense of this contrast, because what we're saying here is that in the parts of this guy's life when he's dressed up as a superhero and doing impressive things, in those parts of his life, he's more successful with women than in the parts of his life when he's just a normal guy wearing a suit and tie. But then, of course, in 5b, we're saying in this parts of his life, he was more successful with women than in those same parts of the life. But that cannot be true. Okay. So this first response is that names actually do not refer to individuals, but rather they refer to temporal phases or temporal parts of individuals' life. Now, this accounts, as I just said, for the differences in truth value above. But in response, Saul argues that this treatment of proper names in terms of them referring to temporal phases has a problem, because it cannot make sense of how these two sentences are true. So it's true that Clark Kent is Superman. But if Clark Kent refers to a different thing than the name Superman does, i.e. Clark Kent refers to a different part of this guy's life than Superman does, then it's not true that Clark Kent is Superman. And in 6b, it's true to say Clark Kent can fly, though he conceals the fact. But if Clark Kent simply refers to the parts of Clark Kent's life where he's not Superman, it seems like this will be false. Now, in response, one could say that these names, Clark Kent and Superman, are actually ambiguous. And in some cases, they refer to individuals, as seems plausible intuitively, and in other cases, they refer to temporal phases. Okay, so the idea is that in 6, these names refer to individuals, but in 4 and 5, the names refer to the other things, temporal phases. Okay, so there isn't really a strong argument that Saul gives against this ambiguity view. However, in general, claiming that there is hidden ambiguity in precisely the ways that are required for certain things to be true or not seems unsatisfying. But that is one kind of potential response. Okay. Now the other response is a bit more complicated, but it's a bit more satisfying, and it involves appealing to something called pragmatics. Okay, so in this course, we've talked a lot about meaning, okay, and truth conditions and reference. Okay, now typically those things have to do with what are called semantics. Okay, but there's another aspect of meaning in a broad sense that's called pragmatics, and doesn't have to do with necessarily with truth or reference, but it has to do more with the way we use language and the kind of information that can be drawn from language when we communicate with each other. Okay, so let me try to make this more precise. Okay, and in particular, first we should note that often utterances are not strictly speaking false, but rather are odd or misleading for other reasons. Okay, so often the things we say in conversation might not be, strictly speaking, false, but there's still something wrong with them. Okay, and now as an overview, what we're going to try to say is that this sentence here, 4b, Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Clark Kent came out. What we're going to say is that 4b is in fact true in the same way that 4a is true. However, it's misleading or odd or weird in some way that doesn't have to do with truth. Okay, so here is another example to try to make sense of this. So, and this is a very different example, but we're gonna say by analogy maybe something similar is happening in the cases that we're concerned with. Okay, so suppose that we're hanging out, and you ask, "Are you hungry? Do you want to get something to eat?" Okay, now suppose that I answer with 7, and I tell you, "Oh, I already ate." Now, suppose that actually I'm very hungry and I do want to get food. Okay. And so when we don't end up making plans to get food, I get annoyed with you and I say, "Why didn't we go get food?" Okay. So suppose that when I say I already ate, in response to your question, "Are you hungry? Do you want to get food?" Suppose that I actually am very hungry and I want to get food. But suppose that all I was saying with saying 7 was that I ate at some time in the past, maybe yesterday. Okay, so when I say that I already ate, strictly speaking, all I'm saying is that there was some time in the past, and it could be a very distant past, in which I ate. Okay, so maybe yesterday, maybe the day before. Okay, so strictly speaking, so if I, didn't actually eat that day that we're having this conversation, strictly speaking, what I said was true. Okay, so because I did eat yesterday or the day before, some time in the past, when I said I already ate, strictly speaking, I said something true. But what I said was very misleading and a bad thing to say. It was an odd thing to say in that context. Okay? Because even though we can say that strictly speaking it was true that sometime in the past I ate, if I say this in response to your question, are you hungry? You you or anyone would naturally just assume that what I meant was that I already ate recently and therefore do not want to get food. Okay, so this content I've put in italics here and I've highlighted is a kind of enriched additional kind of signal that this utterance of the sentence I already ate, even though strictly speaking it's not saying that I already ate recently and I don't want to get food for that reason. 7 is not strictly speaking saying that, it still suggests that. Okay? And so if it's not true that I ate recently, what I've said is still true in a sense. It's just misleading. So similarly, one might think that, again, for B, if you say Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Clark Kent went out, similarly, one might think that actually this is true, but it's misleading in a similar way. Now, the problem that Saul gives to that is that the puzzle isn't just for A and B, but the puzzle also includes 5A and B, obviously, as well as some other sentences that I'm not in the paper that I'm not giving here. Okay, but just thinking about 5A and B, actually you can't simply apply that same explanation that something is strictly speaking false. That something is strictly speaking true, but seems false or it seems odd. Okay, because what has to be explained in 5 is how 5A can be, strictly speaking, false, but seem true. Okay? And that's because, strictly speaking, no one is more successful with women than themselves. Okay? That doesn't make sense that someone has some property that they don't have. Okay? So because 5B is strictly speaking false, we should also have to say that 5A, when I say Superman was more successful with women than Clark Kent, we also have to say that this sentence 5A is strictly speaking false, but it seems true. Okay? So here we can naturally explain, potentially, an analogy with other cases, like the one with you asking if I want to eat and me saying I already ate. We can explain an analogy why something like 4B might be true but seem incorrect. But we also have to explain why something can be false but seem true. Okay, and that's a different thing. That's kind of like where 4B and where this example here is something that's misleading. Okay, I assume that something misleading is something which is true but seems false. How can we make sense of something which is the opposite of misleading? How can we make sense of something which is false but seems true? Okay, and so in trying to account for these puzzles on this pragmatic view, one thing you should do is look at the classic paper by Grice. It's called Logic and Conversation, and he discusses something called conversational implicatures. Okay, but in particular, and then so Grice gives a more detailed theory of what's happening and why when I say 7, I already ate, what I'm suggesting is something more than just that I ate sometime in the past, but that I ate recently, etc. But also, if you this pragmatic route, you have to explain how it is that 5A or something can be, strictly speaking, false but seem true. Okay, and my personal feeling about this is that this pragmatic story is the correct thing to say about Saul's puzzles. But I also don't have anything to say to explain how it is that something can be, strictly speaking, false but seem true. So if this is something that interests you, I think it's definitely very interesting and worth thinking about trying to fill out that explanation here. Okay, now now the pragmatic story and the temporal phases story are the two main possible uh, responses that Saul discusses and argues against in her paper. Now, I will conclude this video and lecture with just some final questions, and I'm not going to develop them in any detail, but these are just final questions to think about if and thinking about these puzzles. Okay, so one set of questions is as follows: is it significant that most of Saul's examples involve fictional characters and superheroes? So she does have some examples, I think, that don't involve that, okay? But it seems like most of them do. So maybe you think these examples that don't involve superheroes that she gives are not convincing. Okay, so if it is a case that all of the examples that are convincing involve fictional characters or superheroes, then maybe that is an insight which could help explain what's happening here. Maybe something really special is happening when we start talking about Superman and Clark Kent, as opposed to when we talk about Venus or actual people in history, for instance, Cicero. But then maybe you can think of your own examples that are convincing as well, that involve normal proper names. Okay, so this is one set of things to think about and potentially try to explain what's happening. Now, the second thing is just to take a step back and think about really is a feeling of the difference between these two sentences here, these contrasts, if it feels like there's a difference in truth value. Okay, so in Frege's original puzzle, which I've repeated here in 8, the idea is that it's just very obvious that 8A and 8B differ in truth value, okay? So it's just very obvious that Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly, but it can obviously be false that Lois Lane believes that Clark Kent can fly. Okay. So there's supposed to be just looking at these two sentences, it should just be obvious in the way that they feel that 8A is true and 8B is false, or that it's possible for the one to be true and the other to be false. And now just in dealing with Saul's puzzle, just take a step back and think, when you consider her puzzle, whether the difference really feels the same way as the difference feels for 8A and 8B. So again, in 9A and 9B, which I've repeated, if I contrast Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Superman came out, with Clark Kent went into the phone booth and Clark Kent came out. Does it really feel that the difference between these two sentences is a difference in truth value and not something else? Okay, so that's the second kind of thing to think about if you are to do this third essay topic.